Okay, so this fellow is Jeffrey Goldberg. He is the editor-in-chief at The Atlantic, and he was seemingly, and I say seemingly, accidentally added to a group chat where the top brass of the Trump administration discussed their upcoming bombing campaign in the Yemen. And apparently he found out about key details of this operation 2 hours before they happened. And this guy is also very much a Zionist, and that is worth mentioning when it comes to the person who accidentally added him. So he wrote this article about it because, of course, that's what you do when you get invited into a secret government chat, is you write a mainstream article about it. To be fair,
if you are the editor of The Atlantic, then yeah.
Mm-hmm. But also, he does claim to have omitted key details that of national security significance, as well as certain people who held Secret Service positions. So some of the stuff that he's apparently seen, we don't know about. So we're just going to have to believe him, take him at his word for some of it.
At LotusEater.com, we are forthright about our support for President Trump. We do not pretend to be unbiased on him, and indeed, it's hard to believe that anyone could claim to be, but we think he is doing the right thing for America, and we support him in his mission. However, when you're an activist for any political interest, it's all too easy to find yourself living in a filter bubble, in which you only receive news from your own side of the aisle. So you build up an incomplete picture of what's actually going on. This is why Ground News is an invaluable tool that we use to keep an eye on both sides of the issues, and one we use regularly when writing the podcast. Each day they pull in thousands of news articles from around the world and organise them by story in one place. And for each story you'll get a visual breakdown of the story's political bias, reliability and ownership. For us, not only is the ability to collate a large number of sources for events incredibly useful, but the blind spot feature is exceptionally important to properly map out the political landscape. What is being covered by the left or the right alone? Well, if you didn't have a tool like this, you wouldn't know. And if you want to be politically informed, then you'd have to spend a huge amount of time combing through left-wing and right-wing media to find out, or you could just use Ground News. Our podcast is only as good as it is because of this feature, which is why we can cover stories that other conservative podcasts often miss. One way of supporting us and keeping your ear to the ground is to go to ground.news/LotusEaters and sign up for their service, which is available in both the browser and via their app. If you subscribe by our link, you get 40% off the Unlimited Access Vantage package for this month only. That's ground.news/LotusEaters. Many thanks to Ground News for supporting us and providing such a useful service.
So supposedly this guy, Jeffrey Goldberg, moved to Israel to work as a prison guard in the IDF before returning to his career in journalism in the US. So that is important because the person who was in charge of this group chat, Mike Waltz, is known as being particularly hawkish. It could be that they share a foreign policy agenda. I don't know.
I would imagine that. I mean, you'll go through the article, I've not read it, but I would imagine he must be in favour of strikes against the Yemen and Houthis, right?
Yeah, it seems like it. And
it'd be pretty shocking if a former IDF member wasn't.
It would be very strange, wouldn't it? And this Mike Waltz guy, I respect his service in Afghanistan. He did multiple combat tours, and he received 4 Bronze Stars, which are received for bravery. But in terms of his politics, he was Defence Policy Director for Bush and Counter-Terrorism Advisor to Cheney. So it might give you a little bit of an idea about how he views foreign policy, which might explain why he might have accidentally invited this guy in.
Accidentally on purpose.
It's possible, yeah. So most Trump supporters have been calling Goldberg a liar, from what I've seen. There have been a few that have taken what he said at face value. And I can see why, given his track record, because both he and Trump have been critical of one another, and he often writes things that are critical of Trump. So the fact that he can't necessarily be trusted, I think, is fair. But he has provided screenshots, and it's not been denied as fake news by anyone involved.
I believe it was confirmed as
it was, yeah,
true by one of the agencies, correct?
I'm going to get to that. I'm going to read the exact quote. And you often see JD Vance as well posting about stuff, because I've seen him do this on a couple of occasions while there's been a mainstream story doing the rounds. He did this about when he said a lot of European countries haven't fought a war in 40 years. He said, listen, obviously I didn't mean Britain and France, because they have, and I know that. And quite often he corrects stuff, and he's not done that in this instance, which makes it more likely, I think, that it's genuine. But I think the nail in the coffin for the fact that it's all made up is the fact that, and this is a quote from the article, so if you take this at face value, so be it. But Brian Hughes, the spokesman for the National Security Council, responded 2 hours later to him reaching out to them saying he's been added to this chat because he messaged the people involved, like, what the hell's going on? And confirming the veracity of the signal group, this appears to be an authentic message chain, and we are reviewing how an inadvertent number was added to the chain. So that doesn't sound like they're denying it exists. It seems genuine.
And that's a confirmation.
Yeah, I would say so. And I'm just wondering, you don't accidentally add the main editor of The Atlantic to a chat of lots of senior politicians in the executive branch of government accidentally.
Like a pretty major cock up.
He either has very, very fat thumbs, or there has been speculation that he might have done it on purpose. And although I'm more willing to take this sort of thing as just an accident, personally, it is possible, and I'm going to walk through the arguments. Obviously, make up your own mind. You don't have to agree with me.
Because if this was done on purpose, surely it makes basic security at the current administration seem completely incompetent.
It does, and I think that that's one of the major arguments against it, is why would they do something that makes them, first and foremost, look incompetent? It doesn't make sense to me that they would do that.
And also shows them actively bad-mouthing their European allies as well.
We'll be getting onto that.
Yeah.
But so there's a couple of things that I think it helps sell. Obviously, there's potential similarities between the person who added him and the guy himself in foreign policy agenda. We can't necessarily know for certain. Haven't seen a sit-down conversation with the two people talking it over, so it's a certain amount of conjecture. But what it does do in leaking this is that it sells to the MAGA base that they're authentically America first, because they complain about Europe not dealing with the rebels. And never mind the fact that previously in the conversation, if it's to be taken as genuine, they admit that only 4% of US trade goes through, is it the Red Sea? That little gulf.
Yes. That's where the
Houthis
are attacking.
That's right, yeah.
Basically, American ships in those countries that are aligned with...
It's America and Israel, basically.
And Israel, which is interesting because they're leaving a lot of European ships alone because most of them aren't signed on to Israel.
Exactly. And 40% of European trade stands to be interrupted by the group. But they point this out as if to say, yeah, we're doing this for Europe, but also Europe's not having their ships attacked because of our either neutral stance or actively siding with the Palestinians. I'm not saying our, as in this is what I think. I stay out of it.
The government's position.
Exactly, yeah. And so the reason the US is intervening, I think, is because it's interrupting their trade and Israeli trade. And, of course, they wouldn't want that, would they? And this should really be the elephant in the room of this story, is that they're sort of misrepresenting it, even in their own internal chats, as we're helping Europe, but Europe isn't being bothered by this thing. It's bothering America and Israel. And so...
I mean, surely America's biggest complaint with Europe is how much they're putting into NATO.
Yeah, which is its own
really relate
separate...
to Houthis.
Yeah, I think it's a separate thing. And although we should be protecting our own trade routes and the Houthi rebels, I'm certainly no friend of them either, I think it's a weak argument because it's not interrupting our trade and it's very far away, and there isn't the same appetite in Europe for foreign adventurism as there is in the US government. And this is something that US citizens are, of course, going to have to foot the bill for. So I'm not having a go. I'm actually kind of annoyed on your behalf that they're going out and interfering, not learning the lessons of, post-2000s wars. But here we are. I'd also argue that one of the main beneficiaries of this bombing campaign are the Saudis, as well as Israel. Israel benefits the most out of all of them, I think, because they're Iran-backed. But of course, the Saudis and Israel are both opposed to Iran. And so by the US doing this, they're basically saying to their allies, look, we got your back. We're putting pressure on the Iranians, basically making sure their resources are wasted and they don't get more influence on the Saudi Arabian peninsula. So that's what I think is actually going on here, which isn't necessarily part of this leak. It's just the operation that it concerns. And the second point about this, why it could possibly be linked, other than showing that America is being guided by America First people, although you could argue they're wasting money here, is that it solidifies Vance as an anti-war candidate, as he voices his objections in the chat to all of it, despite everyone else seemingly in agreement. And
I've
so,
seen the same thread that you're going through right now.
yeah. Now, Vance is obviously the favourite for 2028, and I think that much is, the reason he's been appointed is that he's like a mini Trump. And that's what Trump wants, is he wants someone to carry on his legacy after he steps down.
Yes, and Trump was very vocally in 2015 an anti-war candidate. Very
Exactly.
critical of the Democrat and former Republicans' wars.
Mm-hmm. And he sort of remains untainted by the justification for the strikes that the others make. And so he has this clean reputation that, okay, hey, I've got this unblemished record of not being in favour of any foreign intervention, therefore you can trust me. Which I think is a plausible argument, because it's the best of both worlds for Trump. He still gets to do what he wants without necessarily tainting his successor, which, of course, if we look at Kamala Harris, she had to carry the burden of, look at what Biden did whilst he was president, and you were part of that. And so there's a very real concern there. But I think that it could also just be an accident. And it's worth mentioning as well, to call them war plans is very strong. That's how it's presented in this title here, in the headline. But as with many headlines in mainstream outlets, it's a bit misleading, because as many of the people involved in this chat have said, this wasn't necessarily discussing classified information. It was just us coordinating with each other about various things. But none of the top secret stuff was really in that chat, despite what he's claiming, which I can believe, actually, because you wouldn't... there are lots and lots of different protocols in place to make sure that this sort of information doesn't leak, and you're not supposed to talk on Signal about these sorts of things. And so my guess is that they were sort of talking about it in a more informal way.
I mean, I've seen the leak of Mike Waltz with his fist American flag fire emojis. So, yeah, that seems pretty informal to me.
It does, and I think that...
I wouldn't like to know that there's top secret classified documents going around communicated by emojis in the American administration.
Yeah, my read of the situation is that it was a genuine chat, and he was probably added accidentally, but I don't know for certain, but it's just my guess, and that it was just more informal, and it's been exaggerated to drum up a good and interesting article for The Atlantic, which I think is the most likely, but it's not impossible that it could be the other things I've discussed, which is why I've brought them up in the first place. It's difficult to know.
Again, it does seem to be a major screw-up to even an informal chat with these people, because it also had people like Stephen Miller and others in it, to add a journalist, and not just any journalist, a head editor of a hostile publication to your own administration, and then not notice that that's what you've done. That seems implausibly stupid.
It would be interesting to see whether there's any sort of discipline handed down from the top in the executive, because I think they are treating this like a legitimate mistake. That's the sort of word. Although there have been sort of attempts to deflect it and say it's not genuine, to try and brush it off, but it does seem to be genuine at the very least. But it is worth mentioning as well that a lot of the bombing campaign had already been planned before the guy was even added to the group in the first place. So all of the Marshall stuff was probably not dealt with in Signal chats, as far as we're aware.
I would hope so.
I would hope so as well. But he basically just saw behind the scenes about what they thought, and a lot of it is stuff that, if you know the people involved in the administration, you probably would have guessed that they would have thought these things anyway, but it's just solid confirmation. Some people have been saying things like this: why didn't you just delete the messages or let them know you were incorrectly added to the chat? Sounds like you were more interested in publishing a salacious story than doing the right thing. And I think that this criticism is fair, but I think it misses the interesting parts of this story in the first place.
I'm sorry, no journalist, right or left, if you realise that's what you've been added into, is going to do that.
Because I think in the article he explains this to his credit. He says, I thought at first it was some sort of trap trying to get me to potentially do something silly, as I forgot what he called it, the specific term, but basically like a trap for journalists to make them say something stupid, and then you publish it and show the world, like, look at how stupid they are. That's why he stayed in it. He was sort of observing it to see what the nature of the thing was, which, to be fair, if I were added to a chat like that, I'd probably do the same. So
you just added into a random group chat out of nowhere with a bunch of people who are some of the most powerful people in the world. Oh, sorry, my mistake. I'm going to go now.
Yeah.
You're not going to hang around and see what they're talking about.
Mm-hmm. So
maybe that's dishonest of me, but if you don't think that you do that, I think you're being dishonest with yourself.
Mm-hmm. Lots of people point out that he has played a key role in peddling for the American war machine, the Iraq WMDs, Ukraine, Russiagate, Ansi Mani. I'm not sure what that one's referring to. I probably should know. And loads of other things as well. Here's another article that he's wrote. Trump, Americans who died in war are losers and suckers. So he's just trying to smear Trump's name, isn't he? It's pretty obvious. And he's also the Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda are working together. Again, they're mentioning the Russia collusion, and the Trump said veterans are suckers and losers. And I think that last one is very difficult to sell, but it's all part of the throwing mud at a wall and seeing what sticks. So yes, obviously, lots of people are cynical of this guy at taking his word, because look at his track record. It's about as bumpy as it could possibly be, right? And let's have a look at some of the screenshots from this. This is the stuff that he did share, because some of it he didn't. Here's JD Vance tagging Pete Hegseth. If you think we should do it, let's go. I just hate bailing Europe out again. Let's just make sure our messaging is tight here, and if there are things we can do up front to minimise risk to Saudi oil facilities, we should do it. Sounds fairly reasonable. And then Hegseth says to Vance, I fully share your loathing of European freeloading. It's pathetic, but Mike is correct. I'm not sure which Mike that is. We are the only ones on the planet, on our side of the ledger, who can do this. Nobody else is even close. Question is timing. I feel like now is a good a time as any. Given POTUS directive to reopen shipping lanes, I think we should go, but POTUS still retains 24 hours of decision space. So this isn't exactly top secret, but there is a certain degree of coordination going on with their messaging. And then when it sort of happened, it was just them saying, good job. And there's John Ratcliffe there. I think MAR is Marco Rubio. But there's not a lot there when you actually see the screenshot proof that things were going around. And then we have the article itself here. It's a very long article.
They always are in the Atlantic.
And it goes on and on and on. And blah, 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 blah. That's all stuff we touched on. Let's start here. This is where Pete Hegseth and I come in. On Tuesday, March 11, I received a connection request on Signal from a user identified as Michael Waltz. And it goes on to explain what Signal is. You know what Signal is. It's a messaging app. I assumed that Michael Waltz in question was President Donald Trump's national security advisor. I did not assume, however, that the request was from the actual Michael Waltz. I've met him in the past, and though I didn't find it particularly strange that he might be reaching out to me, I did think it was somewhat unusual given the Trump administration's contentious relationship with journalists and Trump's periodic fixation on me specifically.
I love the way he phrases that like he's completely innocent of anything. Why would he pay attention to little old me?
I know. It immediately crossed my mind that someone could be masquerading as Waltz in order to somehow entrap me. It's not all uncommon these days for nefarious actors to try to induce journalists to share information that could be used against them.
Is entrap the word that you'd been looking for?
I think so.
Yeah.
I then accepted the connection request, hoping that it was the actual national security advisor and that he wanted to chat about Ukraine or Iran or some other important matter. 2 days later, Thursday, at 4:28 p.m, I received a notice that I was to be included in a Signal chat group. It was called the Houthi PC Small Group. And goes on, and he just lists what they were talking about. A lot of it is quite uninteresting, unsurprising. There's a lot of just coordinating with one another about small things, and there's not really that much to it, to be honest. But if you want to read the article, go ahead. I'm not going to go through it all because there's just too much, and it's a lot of boring slog detail. But the gist of it is that they were probably discussing things that should have been kept private, and I think that that's a fair characterization. However, it's not nearly as bad as it's made out to be from the headline, as is always the case. And here is the press secretary for the White House saying this: Jeffrey Goldberg is well known for a sensationalist spin. Here are the facts about the latest story. No war plans were discussed. No classified material was sent to the Fred. The White House Counsel's office has provided guidance on a number of different platforms for President Trump's top officials to communicate as safely and efficiently as possible. And they're looking into how he is inadvertently added. So, complete confirmation here, but they're saying similar things to me, really, that it's not as big a deal as it's being made out to be, but at the same time, it's still a bit of a mistake. It's still a bad look, which I can believe.
It makes your administration look stupid.
It does. And there are a couple of memes that I'm going to end on because they're fun. I do enjoy this.
That's quite funny. Of course, it has to be big fat baby Vance as well.
I'm sorry, JD Vance. You've not really, put that many feet wrong so far, but the edits of your face are funny. I know you're watching, of course. And then another one here. This was actually replied to the post of the article. Anxiety. What if you're not good enough? Depression. Everyone hates you. Hoofy PC small group. Fist bump emoji. American flag emoji. Fire.
They've got my back.
And finally, the reaction in Europe hasn't necessarily been about the leaks themselves. It's been about how the top team rips into America's European allies, saying how they loathe having to bail out the pathetic freeloaders. So obviously it's being presented as sensationalistly as possible, as is the media's way. And also I think that the European media in particular is pushing massively for a rift with the United States, and there's a massive amount of intersecting agenda here for this to happen. And so this has been capitalised on by lots of those forces. But yeah, that's my sort of 2 cents on it. This leaking basically serves to strain the relationship between the US and Europe more generally, and even further than it was already. It might spur on more European independence, which I wasn't personally offended by what they were saying. It's sort of like Europe's not standing up for itself, and they need to be more independent.
Well, it was strange that they were having that discussion in reference to the Houthis, which, as we've discussed, isn't really as much of our problem.
Yeah, and I think in other domains it's a lot more legitimate, like NATO, although I don't think NATO should exist. If it is to exist, it's fair enough that America could object to being disproportionately contributing to that, I suppose. And it strikes me as sort of a non-story to a certain extent, but it's important enough to actually talk about, because I think there's been a lot of smoke and mirrors about the whole thing, and just breaking it down and looking at it slightly rationally is a good way of seeing that it wasn't a big deal. It's slightly interesting, but yeah, I think the Trump regime is going to carry on. It's not a deal breaker for them. And yes, also, if you didn't know America was bombing Yemen, now you do. If you want to support our work, you can always sign up to the website and watch Bo's series, Epochs. This one, he's talking about Lawrence of Arabia with Luca Johnson. You've got to watch it. Look at that thumbnail. And if you want to see all the other things that we're putting out, you can always follow us on X. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.